Police sirens were heard throughout the Denver neighborhood on October 5, 1996, in response to a call about an apartment in the 1900 block of East 17th Avenue. Terry Turchak, a 35-year-old woman, was found dead inside. Terry was found by the police to have been strangled and had suffered serious head injuries. What could have happened between Terry and her attacker to cause her tragic death? And who could have committed such an evil act? With a population of 700,000, Denver, Colorado, has a vibrant mix of history and culture that draws many visitors to its many museums. With a wealth of historical and recreational sites, this city seamlessly blends the old and the new. The small-town feel of Denver's neighborhoods is reflected in the welcoming locals, who are known for their adventurous spirit and who frequently know their neighbors by name. However, Denver faces urban challenges, such as having one of the highest crime rates in the country. This problem casts a shadow over its tight-knit neighborhoods. The unsolved Terry Turchak case from 1996 serves as a sobering reminder of this darker side of the city's existence. Terry Turchak, who was born on May 14, 1961, was from Michigan's vast countryside. She was the daughter of James C. Turchak, a brave Vietnam War veteran and honorable sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. Terry possessed a resilient spirit as a child. While the specifics of Terry's mother are still unknown, her father, James, was the epitome of a loving father to Terry despite his tough exterior as a military man. The fact that Terry wasn't an only child is well known. A few years later after her birth, her younger brother, James Turchak Jr., joined the family, and the two of them quickly developed a strong and close bond that lasted well into adulthood. As time unfolded, Terry accepted motherhood with grace. Her kids' names are unknown, but one thing was undeniable: Terry was a fantastic mother. James Jr. often recalled her maternal tendencies. Terry was always praised for the attention and love she gave to her children. As the years passed, Terry separated from her husband and had made a home at 1900 East 17th Avenue in Denver, Colorado. She had a complicated love life. Although she was in a primary relationship, there were rumors that she was open to other options. Terry's life was in a stable period, with friends, family, and the typical ups and downs. She was maximizing her lifetime. But because of the rise and fall of life, it is impossible to predict what lies ahead. Therefore, no one could have predicted that Terry's happy times were coming to an end. Denver's residents appeared to be going about their daily lives on Friday, October 4, 1996. Unaware of the impending tragedy, Terry Turchak completed her day at work and left for home with the intention of spending the evening with friends. She relished the solitude of her empty apartment while her kids were away. She got ready to partake in Denver's exciting nightlife as dusk fell. Around 8 o'clock, Terry left her apartment. Her spirit coexisted peacefully with the city's spirit. There are traces of Terry's night scattered here and there. Around 11:30 p.m., a neighbor saw Terry coming home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But time and events have a way of taking everyone by surprise. The next day, on Saturday, October 5th, the early morning sun casts long shadows over Terry's apartment building, which had become silent. Strangely, Terry's apartment door remained open. After hours passed, a worried neighbor didn't see the open door until the noon sun reached its highest point. He might have assumed she had overslept or that she was taking a shower. Just to be sure, he peered into Terry's apartment and shouted out her name, but he heard no response despite his voice resonating throughout the living room. Terry was nowhere to be found when a quick search of the living room and kitchen was conducted. The neighbor then made an attempt to do a last stop at her bedroom. He, however, couldn't believe what he saw when he arrived. Terry, who he had just seen the previous evening when she was vivacious and alive, now laid lifeless on the floor of her bedroom. His fear increased. He scrambled for his phone as he hurried outside and dialed 911. His voice trembled in shock as he spoke to the operator. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, getting louder and louder until there was a discord outside Terry's apartment. Police officers who had mastered composure intervened to take control while masking their internal dread. When Terry Turchak's body was found, her case was launched immediately. The entire community was affected, not just her family. Detectives from the Denver Police Department led the investigation to find out what caused this sinister discovery. They understood the significance of the scene in front of them right away. The bedroom depicts a violent story. There were obvious indications of a struggle, suggesting that Terry had fought hard for her life. In an effort to fill in the blanks of that fateful night, neighbors mentioned disturbances between 1 o'clock and 1:30 a.m. The door to Terry's apartment was obviously left open, a spooky invitation to the horror inside, but nobody had reported seeing anyone leave. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator might have known Terry or had gained her trust in order to take advantage of it in the most wicked way, given that there was no sign of forced entry. The medical examiner, Dr. D. Henry, had the grim duty of looking over Terry's body. The outcomes were unexpected. Terry had been severely assaulted in addition to being killed. Her death was attributed to strangulation, but there was also evidence of blunt force trauma, making for a horrifying end to a life that had otherwise been full of promise. A hair found on Terry's thighs stood out as detectives searched Terry's body. They hoped that this small strand of hair would hold the key to discovering who killed her. Investigators connected with Terry's friends and neighbors to piece together the story, and it didn't take long for perplexing tidbits of information to start to emerge. Around 11:30 p.m., Terry was last seen entering her apartment, and a neighbor noticed she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by an African-American man with a unique afro. It was unknown if he was a friend or enemy, but he was the last person seen with Terry. The timeline was further complicated when a different neighbor reported hearing noises coming from Terry's apartment around 12:30 a.m. It's interesting to note that Terry was observed knocking on another neighbor's door at 1 o'clock, appearing to be hurt and pleading, asking for money. Could this be connected to the man she was seen earlier with? Terry's boyfriend, whose identity was kept private, provided the information that was the most revealing. While he had a story from the week before that raised questions, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. Terry and her boyfriend had been robbed and assaulted inside Terry's apartment by 3 unidentified African-American men. Was this incident related to her eventual homicide in any way? The detectives were plagued by that question. The weeks that followed saw the pursuit of leads. Terry was seen with a mysterious man who later became a person of interest. Was he related to the assault from the previous week? Or was Terry's request for cash that night somehow connected to him? Despite the police's best efforts, the reliable evidence required to identify a suspect eluded them. Even though a key suspect was brought in and subjected to questioning and DNA testing, disappointment sets in when the results were revealed. It did not match his DNA. With each passing day, the community's suffering grew worse. For clarification and some semblance of justice, the neighborhood looked to the detectives. The loss of Terry left her family devastated, and they clung to the hope that the offender would be caught and punished. But as the weeks turned into months, the once shining trail started to fade. Despite their best efforts, the detectives had to face the harsh possibility that they might never catch Terry's killer. Sadly, leads that had once shown promise dwindled, and the case became unproductive. However, The cold and seemingly unsolvable case experienced a sudden and unexpected resurgence in 2004. Time's veils, which had concealed clues and obscured the way to justice, were now starting to lift. Nearly 10 years after the horrifying incident, in August of that year, there was a significant development. A hit was detected by the CODIS DNA system. It matched the DNA evidence that had been taken years earlier from Terry's body. For the investigators, this DNA had always been a loose end, a piece of the puzzle that wouldn't fit anywhere. But now, there was a lead. The investigation into this reopened case was given to Detective Dixie, an experienced detective. She was determined to follow this new lead and see where the investigation would go. And this DNA trail led them right to Ricky Dawson thanks to her analytical mind and methodical approach. Ricky had experience with the law. His DNA was already present in the CODIS database, which suggested that he had a criminal history. An African-American man named Ricky Dawson unexpectedly found himself at the center of this investigation. After many years, the Terry Durachak case was once again the focus of the attention of the law enforcement community, now that they had a new lead and a rekindled zeal. It was hoped that this new lead would finally put an end to a troubling chapter in the city's past and bring justice to a person who had been wronged. With a name and a face to work with, Detective Dixie started attempting to understand the relationship between Terry and Dawson. Did they have a mutual relationship? Was there a reason behind the killing? Were there any additional pieces of proof or witnesses that the initial investigation might have missed? As Detective Dixie dug deeper, it became clear that the task at hand was to confirm the DNA match, establish the story, and create a solid case against the new prime suspect. The Denver streets, where rumors and theories about the case once circulated, now awaited news over the case. They eagerly anticipated the day when they would declare Terry had received justice. The majority of the city was upbeat, but there were still many obstacles to be overcome. Although compelling, DNA evidence is not the be-all and end-all of a criminal case. Finding a suspect is one thing, but establishing their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt is quite another. On January 24, 1961, in Florida, Ricky Dawson, a man whose life seemed to contain both darkness and light, was born. In 2004, he was 43 years old. It indicates that he was 35 at the time of Terry Durachak's tragic death in 1996. Terry wasn't his only link to the dark, though. Dawson had his own difficulties when he was younger. There were complications throughout his childhood. It's been said that a person's behavior as a child often provides a window into their future, and Ricky was no exception. His marital status, education, and other personal information are still unknown, but his criminal record is one thing that stands out. The criminal activity that Dawson is involved in is not just in Terry's case. His DNA was discovered to match an unnamed profile from a terrifying case that occurred in Seattle in 2000. Debbie Cascio, a 40-year-old woman, was his victim. The tragic circumstances surrounding Terry's death and Debbie's are similar. Like Terry, Debbie had multiple blunt force traumas and was in pain. Debbie was strangled and had multiple blunt force injuries like Terry as well. The unfortunate relationship between the two women and Ricky Dawson attracted the attention of the law. Once more, the city and Debbie's devoted daughter, Tabitha Johnson, both worked to preserve her memory. As a gesture by the Homeless Remembrance Project to ensure Debbie's story is never forgotten, a leaf of remembrance at the Seattle Justice Center bears her name. Tabitha, who was only 11 years old when her mother died, has been a model of tenacity. She recalls memories of her mother, including times spent at the beach or creating art with glass. Even after becoming a mother herself, Tabitha is still grieving Debbie's loss. Despite her desire for closure and justice, the specifics of her mother's case are still unknown because the Seattle police haven't disclosed more information. The criminal activities of Ricky Dawson continued beyond Seattle and Denver. In 2004, he ended up in Florida's police custody. At that time, Denver police learned that a DNA match connected him to the 1996 Terry Turret Shack cold case. While in Florida, he admitted guilt to second-degree murder in exchange for a 25-year prison term. Now, he is charged with first-degree murder in connection with the Terry Turret Shack case in Denver. The investigation into Terry Turret Shack's murder accelerated as soon as Ricky Dawson's name appeared. Detectives searched for any mention of Ricky in the case files and interviewed transcripts from the initial investigation. Although they weren't able to find his name right away, they were in for a surprise. Ricky's description of the man Terry was with the night she was killed matched that provided by her neighbors. Ricky's criminal history was quickly revealed, and it was shocking. He was a persistent offender. His name was associated with a long list of crimes. Detectives recognized him as a key suspect in Terry Turret Shack's case and knew they needed to speak with him. At the Sewanee Correctional Facility in Florida, where Ricky Dawson was already incarcerated, they came face to face with him in December 2004. Finding out what Ricky knew about Terry and proving his involvement in her tragic demise were detectives' stated objectives. During the interview, another intriguing lead emerged. A friend of Ricky's, whose name was withheld, gave his account about the night Terry was killed. Terry was well acquainted with Ricky's friend. He acknowledged spending time in her apartment with her and Ricky, and even confirmed being there the night she was reported killed. He claimed that all three of them had used drugs. Even though he said he left at midnight, he wasn't aware of what happened next. The puzzle was beginning to come together. A path had now been set out in front of the detectives. They performed an important DNA test. The new DNA samples obtained from Ricky were compared to the major DNA profile of the hair discovered on Terry's body, and there was a match. With this concrete proof, Ricky Dawson's involvement in Terry's death was established, but unexpectedly, no charges were brought against him for her killing right away. Some speculated that this was because Ricky had already served about 20 years of his current sentence. As a result, Terry's case sat idle for more than 10 more years. 14 years later, a new hope for justice surfaced. Detective John McGrail, from the Denver Police Cold Case Unit, was tasked with reviewing the case. McGrail examined the case's details and came to the conclusion that the evidence present was quite convincing. In some ways, the case appeared to be settled. In order to cover all bases, he decided to submit the evidence for additional laboratory testing in December 2018. This included evidence gathered from the crime scene and Terry's post-mortem examination results. By August 2019, the DNA evidence findings had produced a solid match. The wheels of justice began to turn more quickly. Ricky Dawson, the Ricky who had been serving time in Florida's prison for a different crime, was the only person in whom the puzzle pieces pointed. With the fresh evidence in hand, it was obvious that it was time to hold Dawson accountable for the murder of Terry. Time traveled to January 26, 2023, which was an important day in the investigation. Ricky Dawson was officially charged with the first-degree murder of Terry Turret Shack, and an arrest warrant was issued for him. At the age of 62, Ricky discovered himself in a more difficult legal situation. Even though he was already detained in Florida, justice did not stand still. The Denver Police Department obtained his extradition so that he could answer for his actions in Denver. On February 23, when Ricky learned of the allegations against him, the seriousness of the situation hit him. March 23, 2023, was designated as the date of the court appearance, which was eagerly anticipated. Many people anticipate Ricky Dawson will be found guilty for his role in Terry's tragic death, despite the fact that the court's final decision has not yet been made public. They felt this way because of the mounting evidence against him. James Turichak, Terry's brother, never fully recovered from the pain of losing his sister in 1996. He struggled for 27 long years, torn between hope and despair, wondering if Terry's premature death would ever bring about justice. James, however, was overcome by a wave of emotions after hearing the recent news of an arrest in relation to the murder of his sister. James spoke to the media about his unwavering dedication to his sister's case and how he had always held on to the hope that the truth would eventually surface. James became more aware of the seriousness of the situation when he learned that the alleged offender was being extradited to stand trial. He addressed the hole Terry's absence had left, calling it an irreplaceable loss that time would never fill. He often pondered the life experiences she passed up, particularly the joy of becoming a grandmother. James finally recalled that Terry had a contagious spirit that affected everyone she knew. James acknowledged that, despite having a desire for forgiveness, he is still working on it. It is a challenging journey because the pain is still too recent. Above all else, he made clear that he wanted justice to win. James wants to see Terry's memory honored by the justice she deserved 52 years ago by making sure Ricky Dawson faces the full force of the law and is imprisoned for the rest of his days. 28 years old Nancy McKevers passed away in her home in the Durham community of Washington County, Oregon, on a chilly winter morning in 1983. She was thought to have committed suicide, and there was no suspicion of foul play. The family tried to come to terms with Nancy's passing as the case went cold because it was thought to be a suicide. After 40 years, fresh information surfaced that completely altered the case's trajectory. In 2023, the Nancy McKevers case's mystery was finally solved. After 40 years, what new information enabled police to discover the truth? The Portland metro area is made up of Washington County, which is Oregon's second most populous county out of the state's 36 total counties. One of the main factors that draws people to the Washington County of Oregon and makes them want to settle there is the spectacular backdrop and the rich flora that surrounds it. The allure of this area is the friendly people, the old-fashioned homes, and the hills and mountains that surround the splendid landscape. It is the most populous Washington County in America, with about 600,000 residents. It provides a haven for people looking to escape the bustle of daily life with a culturally vibrant community and a wide range of recreational options, like hiking, nature walking, and fishing. But regrettably, it also holds a sinister secret, and it is in this neighborhood that our case today began. In the year 1955, Nancy McKevers was born in Oregon. Lenore Pepper, Nancy's mother, who is currently 97 years old, was accustomed to hearing the adjectives sweet and beautiful used to describe her daughter. Nancy was described as friendly by everyone, regardless of whether they had known her for years or were just meeting her. Both of Nancy's sisters were very close to her. She was loved by both her younger sister, Diane Grill, and her older sister, Janet Eglitis, because she was the middle child. Between her mother and the sisters, she frequently served as a mediator. People enjoyed interacting with Nancy and spending time with her because of her loving, caring nature and outgoing personality. Her maternal instincts were very strong, and she had always been the most compassionate of her sisters. She consequently loved being a mother after she married Randall Randy McKevers and gave birth to a son. Everyone was aware of the fact that she loved being a mother, The aspirations of Nancy's sisters as children were realized because of her love for them and her own child. The three sisters had intended to raise their children jointly. Unexpectedly, the three sisters' first children were born 18 months apart. Their happy and close-knit upbringing was already planned, but in a tragic turn of events, it was to be abandoned in the end. It was a chilly winter morning in the stunning Washington County of Oregon. On January 2, 1983, police received a call from Randall McKevers at 10:38 in the morning. Randall appeared to be inconsolable over his wife's suicide. Deputies from the Washington County Sheriff's Office arrived at the 17300 block of Southwest Rivendell Drive in Durham, a neighborhood that had joined Washington County after 1983 but had not previously been a part of it. The body of Nancy McKevers with a gunshot wound to the head was discovered by the police. Despite the seriousness of the wound and the odds against Nancy surviving, paramedics sped to transport her to a nearby hospital. By merely looking at her, she was almost immediately declared dead. Nancy McKevers' death was determined to be a suicide. At the crime scene, a Smith & Wesson revolver was discovered and taken by the detectives. Inconsistencies on what might have happened to Nancy didn't emerge until after the police began questioning suspects. Only Nancy had been at home during the alleged suicide, along with her 30-year-old husband, Randall, and their 1-year-old son. The crime scene led the investigators to wonder whether Randall had witnessed the suicide or if it took place in a closed area. To make a progress in the investigation, the police needed to wait for the forensic reports. The Nancy McKevers' case proved to be much more complicated than the police had anticipated once they received the reports. It didn't take long for investigators to realize there was something else going on in this case after the autopsy report, forensic tests, and ballistic tests were done. The crime lab of the Oregon State Police quickly determined from the medical reports that the case could not have been a suicide. There were far too many irregularities. It is possible to detect gun residue on someone's hands and clothing by taking samples and processing them to look for fused lead, antimony, or barium particles. The first discrepancy was that Nancy's hands were free of any signs of gunshot wounds, but it didn't directly demonstrate anything. This is because the residue can easily be washed away when it comes into contact with other things and can only be detected 6 to 8 hours after the shot was fired. So, even though it was a significant discovery, it was insufficient. When the medical examiners stated that Nancy's wound was too wide to be a suicide case, the second inconsistency appeared. The distance between the person and the gun's muzzle increases with the size of the wound. The report also mentioned that Nancy was battling or attempting to defend herself if there were charred particles on her clothing. With her husband Randall and their 1-year-old child, Nancy had been at home by herself. There were no other people present, and no instances of forced entry, according to Randall. The police had, of course, located their main suspect. Detectives began questioning Randall as soon as they could. He gave them the essentials, then admitted that he and Nancy had been fighting over the gun and that during the commotion, he couldn't remember who had pulled the trigger. Randall changed his story, withdrew his statement, and gave the officers a new one after the police poked and prodded him further. He admitted to the police that he had just walked in when Nancy pulled the trigger. By the time Randall entered the room and realized what was happening, she had already shot herself. These two iterations were utterly incompatible with one another. The detectives spoke with Nancy's friends, family, and co-workers because it was crucial to learn the truth about what had actually occurred. Every one of them believed Randall was somehow connected to her demise. In order to finally make sense of the situation and establish a solid case against Nancy's husband, the police had only needed a little bit more proof. 2 days after the initial interrogation, the police therefore called Randall in for another round of questioning. They were unable to elicit a confession from him. The police were then visited by Randall's parents, who assured them that their son was prepared to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. But Randall failed to appear for the appointment. He had completely stopped assisting the police by April of that year. The police declared Nancy McKever's alleged suicide case to be cold in the absence of any additional leads or fresh evidence. Nancy's family learned a week after her funeral that there were no leads in the case and that there was no evidence of foul play. The family therefore made every effort to leave this gloomy episode in the past. Not only was Nancy's son deprived of all the love she had to give after her death in 1983, but her entire family also underwent a permanent change. The news had a significant impact on them. They were never the same after Nancy died because she was such a significant part of their lives. When Nancy's family learned of her passing, they were in shock. She was a happy, laid-back woman who delighted in every aspect of parenting. They couldn't believe Nancy shot herself in the head while her son was still inside the house. She would never have taken any action that would have permanently cut off her relationship with her son. Nancy's mother, Lenore Pepper, wasn't sure about the circumstances surrounding her daughter's passing. She had suspicions about Randall, but was unable to speak about them. Lenore Pepper let her suspicions die after she had already lost her daughter, and the police had officially informed them that no foul play was suspected. Randall was in charge of raising his 1-year-old son after facing no charges. Lenore did not want to stir up a situation that she was ill-equipped to handle. She had serious reservations about Randall but chose to remain silent in order to safeguard her grandson, in case her doubts and uncertainties turned out to be unfounded. Everyone who knew Nancy, including her mother, believed that it could not have been a suicide. However, without an answer from the investigators, their skepticism persisted. Nancy's sister thought it was an awful accident that was never intended to occur. She passed away when she was only 28. Her life, her hopes, and all of her dreams vanished in an instant. No one anticipated that the detectives would reopen the Nancy McKever's case in August 2022 because it had been closed for such a long time. The cold case investigations were handled by the police officers working in the Violent Crimes Unit. When they looked through Nancy McKever's file, they realized that justice needed to be done. Even though Nancy hadn't committed suicide, nobody knew it. She was brutally murdered. The police reviewed the previously gathered evidence before proceeding. A member of the investigation team named Detective Anel Seri described the case as being under-investigated. Since the detective in charge of the case from 1983 had already passed away, there was no way to determine why the officers let this case go cold for so long. It was discovered that the police work of the 1980s was not thorough. The Washington County Sheriff's Office's Forensic Science Unit retested the 1983 evidence, and the results were exactly the same as before. The likelihood that Nancy's death was a suicide was entirely discounted. The police now think that domestic violence played a role in Nancy McKever's passing in this case. Due to concerns for the family's privacy, investigators decided not to disclose to the media which new leads were investigated. Around 20 people were interviewed by the police, including deputies, detectives, firefighters, and family members who were either there in 1983 or had a close connection to the case. Nancy's story was still relevant 40 years later, and as more information emerged after all these years, the mystery surrounding the case started becoming clear. According to Nancy's file, which was kept with the police, detectives learned that during the case's initial investigation, when the police questioned Nancy's family and Randall, They learned that Randall had been planning to kill Nancy because she wanted a divorce and to leave him. One of the case's investigators, Anel Seric, expressed his perplexity over the lack of action in the 1980s in spite of this clear evidence. "I can't tell you why they did what they did," he said. Eventually, everything started to make sense, and Randall started to emerge as the main suspect in Nancy McKever's murder. By the time the evidence came to light, Randall was residing in Tybard, an Oregon town 10 miles south of Portland. In January 2023, the police showed up at his home and questioned him about the murder of his wife 40 years ago. He admitted to the detectives that hypnotherapy had been used to help him forget everything about that day. By this point, the police had enough leads, and since they desired that Nancy's family experience genuine closure, they sent the case to the Washington County District Attorney's Office for review after speaking with Randall. It turned out that the information Nancy's family was given for 40 years was false. The Nancy McKever's case had undergone enough twists by this point. So when police learned that Randall had killed himself on February 8, 2023, they were horrified. Additionally, he left a note in which he explicitly denied being to blame for Nancy's death. The police thought that Randall's passing brought the case to a conclusion, even though the district attorney's office was unable to review it after his passing. Now that their main suspect has passed away, Nancy McKever's case has been successfully concluded. Lenore was shocked to learn that her suspicions about her daughter's death had been accurate the entire time when the police contacted her. Lenore, the mother of Nancy, expressed her appreciation to the policemen for being able to see her daughter's case through to the end. She wished Nancy's father had lived to see the conclusion of their daughter's case. Everyone loved Nancy, so the news of her heinous murder caused a wide range of emotions. Her family experienced all their emotions again, but everyone in the family thought that Randall's suicide was just as much of a witness as his actual court case. Although he insisted he had nothing to do with Nancy's death, his own passing served as the acceptance Nancy's family had been hoping for 4 decades. Following the shock of learning that their cherished Nancy had been murdered after 40 years, Nancy's family is informing more of her loved ones of the news, and they are preparing to hold a memorial service for her. Nevertheless, they have experienced fresh grief and trauma. The investigation team that gave her justice was applauded by the entire family. Nancy's family had the misconception that she had committed suicide for 40 years. Although the investigation into Nancy McKever's death has been concluded, Washington County Sheriff's Office deputies are still looking for additional information. They want anyone with fresh information to come forward and contact the detectives at 5038462700, so that Nancy, who was thought to have chosen death for all these years, can receive justice. Do you think Randall murdered his wife? Why couldn't the 1980s detectives establish a convincing case against Randall? Please share your thoughts with us in the comments. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe and alert for the next mystery to be unraveled.